My sister sat at our mother's dining table, accepting praise for being a devoted single mother who never let her 8-year-old son go hungry. She smiled softly while my mother patted her hand. What nobody at that table knew was that for 180 school days, I had been the one quietly paying off my nephew's negative meal balance so he could eat hot food instead of the state-mandated cheese sandwiches. I never said a word because I work in school nutrition, and protecting a child's dignity is my job. I sat there drinking my iced tea, letting my sister take the credit. But 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the living room window. A white passenger van from New Hope Baptist Church pulled into the driveway. 2 volunteers stepped onto the porch, carrying heavy cardboard boxes marked benevolence. When my mother opened the door, the volunteer did not ask for my sister. She looked down at her clipboard and asked for me. My name is Marianne Chandler, and I am 35 years old. Before I tell you what was written on that clipboard and the lie my own sister orchestrated using my name, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Front Porch Revenge. But only do that if this story truly resonates with you. Also drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I always read them to see who is tuning in. Now let me take you back to the start of that Sunday dinner outside Columbia, Missouri, the night my private compassion was turned into a public weapon. The ranch house my parents Gary and Linda owned sat on a modest lot bordered by old oak trees. It smelled of pot roast green beans and the faint citrus tang of my mother's signature lemon pie. Sunday dinner functioned as a mandatory performance in our family. Attendance was required. Adherence to the script was expected. Missouri culture relies heavily on these quiet neighborhood networks where respectability is the highest currency, and keeping up appearances matters more than telling the truth. We gathered around the dark wood table. My mother sat near the kitchen's swinging door, orchestrating the flow of serving bowls. My father occupied the head of the table, eating with quiet, methodical bites. He rarely interrupted his wife. My sister Denise sat across from me. Her acrylic nails clicked against her ceramic plate as she checked her phone. Travis, her latest boyfriend, was notably absent, but his name flashed across her illuminated screen twice in rapid succession. Next to Denise sat my 8-year-old nephew Caleb. Caleb sat with his small knees tucked tight against the wooden rungs of his chair. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the adults. While my Aunt Beverly detailed the latest neighborhood gossip, Caleb carefully tore a store-bought dinner roll in half. He ate one piece. The other half he quietly folded into a paper napkin and slipped into the pocket of his jeans. My chest tightened. I coordinate the nutrition program for the local school district. I spend 40 hours a week managing cafeteria logistics and reviewing student meal accounts. I know exactly what it means when a child hoards bread at a dinner table. They save food like evidence against tomorrow's hunger. It is a survival mechanism born from deep uncertainty. My mother did not notice the napkin. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Denise's wrist, offering a warm, encouraging smile. "You do such a wonderful job with him," Linda said, her voice carrying over the clatter of silverware. "Being a single mother is so demanding. 180 school days a year, and you never let that boy go without a proper meal. You always find a way to provide. We are all so proud of you." Denise offered a tired, gracious smile. She accepted the praise effortlessly. "Thank you, Mom," she murmured, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It gets hard, but Caleb is my priority." I took a slow sip of my iced tea, holding the cold glass against my bottom lip. The audacity of her performance rattled against my ribs. For 9 months, I had logged into the district portal every Friday afternoon. I transferred funds from my personal checking account to Caleb's student profile, keeping his balance positive. Denise never asked me to do it. I simply noticed his account dropping into the negative tier back in August. Rather than embarrass my sister or risk Caleb facing the stigma of a substitute meal, I handled it quietly. I absorbed the cost because a child eating should never depend on an adult's fragile pride. Denise knew the meals were covered. She never questioned why the school stopped sending negative balance notices. She just accepted the invisible safety net and claimed the resulting applause for herself. I remained silent. Calling her out at the table meant exposing Caleb. Children internalize adult financial disputes. They learn to equate their own basic needs with conflict. My professional instinct demanded I protect the boy first and address the mother second. The conversation drifted toward Uncle Ron discussing local farming equipment. I planned to pull Denise aside after pie and demand she stop weaponizing my silence. The universe possessed a different timeline. Bright halogen headlights cut through the gathering dusk outside. The beams swept across the floral curtains of the living room window, casting long, shifting shadows across the dining table. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over gravel interrupted the quiet suburban evening. My father paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He leaned back, attempting to see through the glass. "Who is pulling into the driveway during dinner?" he asked. My mother stood up, wiping her hands on an apron. She walked briskly to the front door, pulling the curtain aside. "It is the white passenger van from New Hope Baptist," Linda announced, sounding thoroughly confused. Denise stiffened. Her phone dropped onto the table with a sharp clack. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. "Mom, do not open the door." Denise said, her voice rising an octave higher than normal. "Just let them leave it." My mother ignored the request, turning the brass deadbolt and swinging the front door wide. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the entryway. The cool Missouri evening air drifted into the warm house, carrying the scent of damp soil. 2 figures stepped out of the church van. I recognized them immediately. Carol Whitaker, a retired nurse who managed the community outreach programs, and Vernon Pruitt, an elderly deacon who drove the delivery routes. Vernon hauled 2 large, heavy cardboard boxes onto the concrete porch. The word benevolence was stamped across the side of the corrugated cardboard in thick black ink. Carol carried a wooden clipboard. She offered my mother a polite, hesitant smile. "Evening, Linda," Carol said, shifting her weight. "We are sorry to interrupt your Sunday dinner. We have the emergency pantry delivery." My mother frowned, staring at the boxes of canned goods and paper towels. "Emergency delivery," she repeated. "Carol, there must be some sort of mix-up. Gary and I do not require assistance from the pantry. We have plenty." "Marianne, do not look like that," Linda said, turning to me with a sudden defensive edge. "People need help sometimes. There is no shame in a community doing its part." My mother assumed the boxes were meant for Denise. She immediately deployed her protective shielding, ready to excuse her daughter's financial instability as a temporary hardship. Carol cleared her throat, tapping her pen against the metal clip. "I am not here for Denise," Carol clarified. She looked past my mother, making direct eye contact with me. "Marianne Chandler," she asked. I stopped walking. The ambient noise of the house faded into a dull, distant hum. "I am Marianne," I answered, stepping onto the porch. Carol offered a sympathetic nod, extending the clipboard slightly. "We have your household request right here, Marianne. Vernon brought the dry goods, and I have the sealed grocery cards for the perishable items. Where would you like us to set them down?" The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the concrete. I looked at the heavy boxes of charity food. I looked at the church volunteers who knew my face from the school district. Then I looked back at my sister. Denise stood near the edge of the living room. She refused to meet my gaze, staring intently at the baseboards. The puzzle pieces locked together with precise clarity. My quiet Friday payments were not merely a hidden convenience for her. She had converted my silence into a shield and weaponized my professional credibility. She used my clean reputation to secure church donations, ensuring her own name remained unblemished while reaping the rewards. The reputation I spent years building in Columbia, balancing school budgets and advocating for childhood nutrition, was suddenly tethered to an emergency charity request I never made. My instinct urged me to scream the truth. The words burned in my throat. I wanted to drag Caleb's school ledger into the light and force Denise to read the Friday deposits aloud. But Caleb stood a few feet away, still holding the napkin with the hoarded bread in his pocket. The child was already terrified of hunger. I could not turn his trauma into a weapon for my own vindication. I stepped past my mother, blocking the doorway so the volunteers could not enter the house. "Carol," I said, keeping my tone remarkably steady, "why is this delivery addressed to me? I did not submit a benevolence request." Carol frowned, her brow creased in genuine confusion. She flipped the top page on her clipboard, running her finger down a printed form. She read the lines, adjusting her reading glasses. "Well, that is strange," Carol murmured. She looked back up at me, her expression shifting from polite sympathy to cautious concern. "It says right here you asked us not to call first because your family did not know how bad it had gotten." Carol stepped past the threshold, clutching her wooden clipboard against her chest like a shield. Behind her, Vernon bent his knees and lowered the 2 heavy cardboard boxes onto the porch concrete. Bright orange inventory labels clung to the sides of the corrugated cardboard, detailing the exact charity provisions. The printed lists cataloged the contents with stark efficiency: canned chicken, white rice, breakfast cereal, creamy peanut butter, rolls of paper towels. Resting on top of the second box sat a standard white church envelope containing 2 preloaded grocery cards. The setup mirrored the exact emergency packages my school district coordinated for families facing sudden job loss or medical bankruptcy. I did not look at the canned goods or the sealed envelope. My focus remained entirely on the paperwork held by the outreach coordinator. Institutional records are protected by strict privacy guidelines, but verifying a designated point of contact falls within standard operational boundaries. I asked Carol calmly to show me only the specific line bearing my identity. She hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Her knuckles turned white around the metal clip, clearly caught between her benevolence training and the unfolding domestic dispute. Slowly, she angled the board just enough for me to read the printed intake form. There it was, in stark black ink. Marianne Chandler, household contact. The sound of screeching wood pierced the heavy kitchen air. Denise pushed her dining chair back with such force that the legs gouged the linoleum flooring, leaving dark rubber streaks behind. She scrambled to her feet, her face flushing an angry crimson. Before I could process the depth of the forgery, my mother lunged forward. Linda reached out, attempting to snatch the clipboard right out of the volunteer hands. "This is private church business," Linda declared, her voice sharp and defensive. Carol stiffened, pulling the paperwork back against her chest, while a flash of genuine offense crossed her features. Out on the porch, Vernon wiped sweat from his brow and cast uneasy glances between my sister and me. The tension in the room escalated into a suffocating humidity. Aunt Beverly leaned close to my ear, her breath carrying the scent of sweet tea. "You should not embarrass a mother in front of volunteers," she whispered harshly. Embarrassment had nothing to do with my inquiry. A coordinated fabrication was unraveling in my childhood kitchen, and the collateral damage was pointing directly at my career. Carol cleared her throat, attempting to restore order to a situation she clearly did not understand. "Denise told the benevolence committee you were helping raise Caleb." Carol explained, her eyes darting toward my sister. "She said you were handling his expenses, but were too proud to ask the congregation directly for support." The sheer scale of the deception settled over me like a weighted blanket. My sister had not just stolen my credibility. She spun a narrative framing me as a struggling, prideful caretaker to justify tapping into community charity funds. Denise buried her face in her hands. The tears arrived right on cue, acting as a well-rehearsed mechanism designed to deflect accountability. "I was trying to protect you from gossip," Denise cried, her shoulders heaving with manufactured sobs. "Protect me by putting my name on a request I never made?" I asked, keeping my tone flat and analytical. Denise dropped her hands, her wet eyes flashing with venomous resentment. "You always make help sound ugly when it is for me." The hypocrisy hung thick in the dining room. I looked past my weeping sister toward the table. The sealed white envelope containing the grocery cards now sat precisely between the glass salt shaker and Linda's silver pie knife. Vernon had quietly brought it inside before retreating to the van. That small paper rectangle represented everything broken in this family dynamic. My quiet, consistent financial support had been twisted into a public display of my supposed inadequacy, allowing Denise to harvest flexible resources without lifting a finger. My professional instincts urged me to confiscate the envelope, call the church committee, and expose the 18 weeks of cafeteria payments immediately. The facts were on my side. The ledger in my phone could destroy her lie in 60 seconds. Yet standing just a few feet away in the hallway shadow was Caleb. The boy still had the hoarded piece of bread hidden in his pocket. If I launched a full-scale interrogation right now, the resulting screaming match would permanently associate his need for food with explosive adult trauma. I could not inflict that psychological damage on him. I stepped back, creating physical distance between myself and the stolen charity. I instructed Carol to leave the sealed boxes unopened on the porch. I informed the outreach coordinator that I would visit the church office on Monday morning to formally correct the contact registry. Denise lost whatever remaining control she held over the narrative. She sputtered, demanding the groceries be brought into the kitchen, but the volunteers were already backing away, unnerved by the fractured family facade. My refusal to escalate the fight granted my sister a temporary reprieve. I prevented a screaming spectacle, but my restraint left a dangerous vacuum. My mother and my aunt immediately rushed to comfort the weeping victim, validating Denise's tears while casting me as the cold, calculating antagonist. The familiar suffocating roll tightened around my neck. Be useful. Stay quiet. Do not ever make your sister cry. The private act of feeding a child had mutated into a public scandal that now entangled the entire New Hope Baptist congregation. My reputation among the very people I worked alongside was actively bleeding out on my mother's linoleum floor. Carol and Vernon retreated down the driveway, their van engine rumbling to life in the dark. The heavy front door remained open, the glass storm door catching the reflection of the porch light. Caleb stepped out from the hallway shadows. He walked slowly toward the glass, pressing his small hands against the cold pane. He stared intently at the stacked cardboard boxes resting outside. His eyes tracked the bright orange inventory labels. "Mom?" the boy asked, his soft voice cutting through the tense silence of the living room. "Is that the kind of cereal with marshmallows? Or is that for Aunt Marianne?" The heavy diesel engine of the church van rumbled down the driveway, fading into the humid Missouri night. Out on the concrete porch, the two benevolence boxes sat undisturbed exactly where I had demanded they remain. The bright orange inventory labels glowed faintly under the yellow porch light, shifting instantly from symbols of community charity into markers of a blistering family accusation. Inside the house, the atmosphere rapidly reorganized itself to protect the fragile status quo. Linda wasted no time deploying her crisis management skills. She ushered Caleb away from the glass storm door, pressing a large slice of leftover lemon pie into his small hands. She directed him toward the living room television, instructing him to watch cartoons. The boy shuffled away, but his gaze lingered on the locked front door, his posture tense and uncertain. He knew adults were fighting over food. With the child safely out of earshot, my mother pivoted back to the kitchen, launching her counteroffensive. "You could have let them set down the groceries and talked later," Linda hissed, her voice dropping into a harsh, accusing whisper. "You did not have to make a spectacle on the front steps." Denise stood near the sink, vigorously wiping her tear-stained cheeks with a paper towel. The performance continued seamlessly. She sniffled, adjusting her posture to project the image of a wounded martyr. "I only used your name because people trust you." Denise offered, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "The outreach committee knows you work for the district. They process things faster when an official contact is listed. I just wanted to make sure Caleb had enough for the week." My father, Gary, sat deep in his recliner, holding the television remote. He muted the baseball game, staring blankly at the dark screen. He possessed the physical stature of a man who worked construction for 40 years, yet he remained entirely passive while his oldest daughter was publicly crucified in his own home. He did not utter a single word in my defense, choosing the comfortable cowardice of silence over the grueling friction of truth. Aunt Beverly leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing her arms tight against her floral blouse. "Your sister is doing the best she can, Marianne," she declared. adopting a tone of profound moral superiority. Not everybody has a steady school paycheck and a secure government pension. We have to extend grace during difficult seasons. The coordinated gaslighting was breathtaking. They were actively rewriting a felony identity theft as a simple, desperate act of maternal survival. I stood my ground, refusing to absorb their displaced guilt. I have helped Caleb privately since August, I stated my voice level, refusing to match their hysterical pitch. I will continue ensuring he eats every single day safely and consistently, but I absolutely will not allow anyone to forge my name on a community aid application to harvest grocery cards. Denise slammed her hand flat against the laminate countertop. The paper towel crumpled in her fist. You paid for his lunch because you wanted to feel superior. She snapped the venom, finally bleeding through the tears. You love playing the savior so you can look down on me and remind everyone how dysfunctional my life is compared to your perfect little spreadsheets. The accusation struck with hollow, vicious accuracy. Denise possessed an uncanny ability to twist genuine compassion into a weapon attacking the very motive behind the generosity she eagerly consumed. I had never sought a single thank you. I paid the cafeteria balance because a child whispered to me that he was tired of cold cheese sandwiches. My mother stepped between us, forming a physical barrier to shield her golden child. If you really cared about Caleb, Linda said, her eyes narrowing with cold judgment, you would not care who got thanked on a piece of paper. A good aunt provides without demanding a plaque. I looked past the 3 angry women staring at Caleb's school backpack slung over the back of a dining chair. The front pocket hung open, revealing a broken zipper hastily repaired with a strip of silver duct tape. The physical evidence of neglect contrasted violently with the $400 smartphone currently resting in Denise's back pocket. I realized arguing facts against deliberate delusion was a catastrophic waste of energy. My lifelong habit of solving problems privately kicked in, overriding my need for immediate vindication. I believed my quiet competence would eventually speak for itself. It was a massive strategic error. By choosing to walk away without systematically dismantling their narrative in front of Beverly and Ron, I handed my mother the pen to write the official family history. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my cell phone. Bypassing the screaming match, I walked directly onto the front porch, leaving the door wide open behind me. The damp night air felt momentarily cleansing. I activated the camera application, holding the device steady over the cardboard boxes. I snapped 2 clear time-stamped photographs of the benevolence labels, specifically documenting the section where my name was printed as the primary household contact. I did not touch the sealed envelope containing the grocery cards. I did not open the boxes to inventory the peanut butter and canned chicken. I simply gathered my evidence and walked down the steps toward the driveway. My refusal to engage further gave me physical control over my exit, but it surrendered total control over the story. My aunt and uncle would leave this dinner believing I was a rigid, heartless bureaucrat who prioritized paperwork over a hungry nephew. The insult landed deeply, not because it was true, but because my silence had provided the fertile ground for the lie to take root. As I unlocked my car door, the pale glow of a notification illuminated the dark driveway. Through the living room window, I saw Aunt Beverly pull her phone from her purse. Her screen lit up with an incoming message notification from the family group chat. The text sent by my mother arrived before I even shifted the vehicle into gear. "Pray for Denise tonight," Linda wrote, her words broadcasting instantly across the digital network. Mary Ann made the food delivery very difficult. Fluorescent lights buzzed a steady, monotonous rhythm above the district nutrition office. The space smelled of industrial sanitizer and warm cardboard. Early Monday morning offered a brief window of administrative quiet before the chaos of feeding 2,000 elementary students erupted. I arrived 45 minutes before my scheduled shift carrying a large thermos of black coffee. The exhaustion from the previous night lingered in my shoulders, a heavy, dull ache stemming from 3 hours of restless sleep. At the far end of the room, Alma Reed stood over a stack of daily logistics binders. Alma managed the cafeteria operations at the specific elementary building where Caleb attended the 3rd grade. She possessed the sharp, no-nonsense demeanor of a woman who had spent 40 years ensuring rural Missouri children received adequate calories regardless of their home environments. At 61, she commanded fierce respect from the custodial staff and the district superintendent alike. Alma looked up as I keyed the door code. She scrutinized my posture, taking in the dark circles under my eyes and the rigid set of my jaw. "Family dinner or tornado?" Alma asked, setting a clipboard down beside a cooling tray of wrapped blueberry breakfast muffins. Usually the two events share the same damage radius. I offered a tired half-smile, dropping my heavy tote bag onto my desk chair. "A tornado passes through faster," I replied, sitting down and waking up my computer monitor. I stared at the blank screen, debating how much professional distance I needed to maintain. Alma was a colleague, but she also sat on the finance committee at New Hope Baptist, holding significant sway within the very church circle my mother was currently weaponizing against me. Maintaining strict student confidentiality is the bedrock of our profession. I could not ethically pull up Caleb's internal district meal ledger to prove my sister was lying. Doing so would violate federal privacy guidelines and compromise my career. However, I could demonstrate the flow of my own capital. Reaching into my purse, I unlocked my personal smartphone, navigating directly to my mobile banking application. I filtered the transaction history, pulling up the recurring outbound transfers logged every Friday afternoon since late August. I deliberately scrolled past the recipient details, keeping the student identification numbers redacted from view. The screen displayed only the date timestamps and the consistent dollar amounts flowing out of my personal checking account. I walked over to the prep counter and slid the illuminated device across the laminate surface toward the cafeteria manager. Alma adjusted her reading glasses, peering down at the digital ledger. She studied the steady, unbroken rhythm of the weekly payments. Her brow furrowed, deepening the permanent lines etched across her forehead. The realization clicked into place instantly. Then why did I hear at church yesterday morning that Denise has been doing it all herself? Alma asked, her voice dropping into a hushed, concerned register. My blood ran cold. The chill radiated outward from the center of my chest, paralyzing my breath. The timeline meant my mother and sister had planted the seeds of their false narrative hours before the benevolence van even pulled into the driveway. They were actively curating the congregation's perception, ensuring Denise was viewed as a struggling, heroic mother overcoming immense odds. Linda's story had already breached the containment of the Sunday dinner table, jumping seamlessly into the Sunday school circle and creeping toward the school cafeteria grapevine. The speed of the character assassination was breathtaking. Alma leaned against the counter, twisting a thin mesh hairnet around her wrist like a rubber band. The tension in the elastic mirrored the sudden strain in the room. "The ladies' circle is talking, Marianne," she warned gently, keeping her tone free of judgment but heavy with reality. "They are saying you embarrassed your sister over pantry food. The rumor going around the fellowship hall is that Marianne Chandler wants a medal for buying a child lunch. They think you are holding financial support over her head to control her parenting." The words hit me like a physical blow. The very act of feeding my nephew quietly to preserve his dignity was being publicly broadcast as a manipulative power play. I slumped against the filing cabinet, feeling the suffocating weight of the coordinated smear campaign. "I never wanted a medal, Alma," I whispered, staring at the cooling breakfast muffins. "I started making those transfers the second week of school." Caleb came through the lunch line and quietly asked one of the servers if he had to eat the alternative cheese sandwich again. He looked so defeated. Kids know what that sandwich means. I just set up an automatic debit so he would never have to ask that question again. I never even wanted him to know where the money came from. He just needed to eat like a normal kid. Alma sighed, releasing the twisted hairnet from her wrist. "You protect children," she stated, her gaze softening with genuine professional respect. "I understand that instinct. It makes you excellent at your job. But adults will use your silence if you let them. When you refuse to write the narrative, the liars will gladly hold the pen for you." The warning shattered my remaining hesitation. My lifelong habit of absorbing conflict privately to maintain the family peace was actively destroying my standing among the people who trusted my professional integrity. My reputation in Columbia relied on transparency and ethical conduct. If the church board believed I was financially abusing a single mother, my ability to advocate for community resources would evaporate. I could not wait until Monday afternoon to resolve the paperwork. The lie was moving too fast. I needed to cut off the supply line before the next benevolence request hit the docket. Retrieving my phone from the counter, I drafted a direct text message to Carol Whitaker. I requested an urgent face-to-face meeting at the church before the end of the day, emphasizing the need to clarify the contact registry associated with my name. My privacy instinct screamed at me to handle this over an email, but Alma's blunt advice pushed me toward action. I began correcting the long-standing pattern of avoidance, recognizing that protecting my own boundaries was now the only way to genuinely protect Caleb's resources from adult misuse. The phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the heavy silence of the office. The response from the outreach coordinator arrived swiftly, signaling that the confrontation was unavoidable. Carol agreed to the meeting, but she added a stipulation that escalated the stakes significantly. Come before choir practice. Carol wrote her message brief and formal. Nancy from the pantry wants to be there too. The heavy oak doors of New Hope Baptist Church swung open, revealing the vast, quiet expanse of the fellowship hall. The air inside smelled of floor wax and the lingering aroma of industrial coffee brewed during Sunday morning services. The cavernous room felt empty and expectant, echoing with the slight squeak of my rubber-soled shoes against the polished linoleum. Heavy plastic folding tables were stacked neatly against the pale beige walls, waiting for the next community event. A large cork bulletin board dominated the far corner, plastered with brightly colored flyers, advertising an upcoming chili supper, a high school youth group car wash, and a prominent sign reading "Pantry Packing Wednesday" in bold black letters. The very infrastructure of community goodwill surrounded me, standing as a stark contrast to the cynical manipulation my sister had orchestrated. I found Carol Whitaker standing near the entrance to the industrial kitchen, looking deeply uncomfortable. Beside her stood Nancy Tate, the formidable matriarch of the Benevolence Committee. Nancy possessed the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who had spent 35 years working as a senior bank teller before retiring to manage the church finances. Her silver hair was pinned back immaculately, and she carried the wooden clipboard with the same serious authority she once used to audit loan applications. She did not suffer fools, and she possessed zero tolerance for financial discrepancies, regardless of the social standing of the families involved. Carol offered a tight, nervous smile, avoiding my eyes. Nancy wasted no time on pleasantries. She stepped forward, holding the clipboard out, bridging the gap between us. The retired bank teller tapped a bright red pen against the top sheet of paper. "Marianne," she began, her voice carrying a no-nonsense clarity that echoed off the high ceilings. "I need you to tell me plainly, is this your request?" I looked down at the freshly printed document secured under the metal clip. The form detailed a new emergency aid petition requesting a supplementary pickup scheduled for the upcoming Friday afternoon. The designated recipient line clearly stated Marianne Chandler Household. The audacity of the paperwork hit me like a physical blow. Denise had not merely orchestrated a one-time deception. She was actively building a recurring pipeline of untraceable grocery cards and pantry provisions, relying entirely on the assumption that my ingrained Midwestern guilt would force me to absorb the lie and cover for her indefinitely. She intended to keep drawing from the well under the protective shield of my professional credibility. I did not flinch. I did not offer a tearful explanation about family dynamics or dive into the specific details of Caleb's negative cafeteria balance. Maintaining the boundary required absolute clinical precision. "No," I answered, my voice steady and resolute, locking eyes with Nancy. "That is not my request. My name is not available for anyone else's need." The retired bank teller nodded once, a brisk, decisive motion. Without asking for further justification, Nancy pressed the tip of her uncapped red pen to the paper. She drew a thick, dark line straight through the active request, crossing out the Chandler household designation with unyielding finality. In the margin, she scribbled "contact removed," pending clarification in precise, sharp cursive. Carol let out a long, shaky exhale, the sound carrying a mixture of relief and profound embarrassment. The institutional machinery of the church had officially paused the exploitation. The immediate threat was neutralized, and the pipeline was severed. The victory proved short-lived. The heavy double doors at the entrance to the hall burst open, slamming loudly against the drywall. Denise stormed into the room, her face flushed a dark mottled red. Linda trailed closely behind her, breathless and visibly agitated. Aunt Beverly had clearly functioned as an effective early warning system, alerting them the moment I requested a meeting with the committee leaders. They had driven across town, determined to intercept the confrontation and wrestle control of the narrative back into their grasp. "You came to church to cut off food from my son." Denise shouted, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria as she marched across the linoleum. She aimed the accusation loudly, ensuring the words bounced off the walls and registered clearly with the 2 volunteers standing beside me. The tactic was transparent, attempting to immediately frame my boundary as an act of cruel, calculated starvation against an innocent child. I turned to face my sister, planting my feet firmly on the polished floor. I did not raise my voice to match her dramatic pitch. "I came to stop you from using my name," I stated plainly, delivering the truth in front of the very people she had manipulated just 24 hours prior. The public correction landed heavily, stripping away the protective layer of her private deceit. The next aid request could not proceed without my explicit authorization, and I had just explicitly denied it in front of the committee chair. My mother stepped forward instinctively, moving to shield her favored daughter from the consequences of her own actions. Linda offered a tight, condescending smile, attempting to smooth over the jagged edges of the confrontation with folksy charm. "You could fix this by being generous instead of technical." "Marianne," she suggested, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive disappointment. "It is just paperwork. Why are you making such a terrible fuss over a few boxes of groceries when your sister is trying so hard to keep her head above water?" The sheer manipulative power of her statement was staggering. She demanded I legally and morally co-sign a fraudulent aid request, framing identity theft as a simple act of familial generosity. I stared at my mother, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of guilt pressing against my ribs because the word food remained inextricably linked to Caleb. The boundary I set was entirely about adult dishonesty, but my family ruthlessly weaponized the child's basic needs to make me feel like a monster for enforcing it. I held my ground, refusing to engage in a cyclical argument about generosity with people who viewed my compliance as an unlimited resource. The red pen remained uncapped in Nancy's hand, a stark physical reminder that the institutional authority rested with the church, not with Linda's emotional extortion. The retired teller had heard enough of the domestic theater. She tapped the metal clip against her palm, drawing the attention of the room back to the documents she controlled. The immediate request was dead, but the historical record told a much deeper story. Nancy closed the clipboard, folding the top sheet over. She looked directly at me, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Marianne," she said, her voice dropping into a grave, serious register that silenced the entire hall. "This is not the first form with your name on it." Nancy lowered the clipboard, sliding it into a thin manila folder resting on the adjacent folding table. She extracted 3 older benevolence request forms, laying them side by side against the beige plastic surface. The crisp white paper contrasted sharply with the dull table, forming a tangible timeline of systematic deceit. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm triggered by the sheer volume of forged documents sitting in plain view. Denise had not merely stumbled into a one-time lie of convenience. She had established a robust supply chain, built entirely upon the foundation of my stolen identity. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall swung open, interrupting the tense silence. Pastor Don Wilkes stepped into the room holding a stack of hymnals. He was a pragmatic man accustomed to navigating the delicate politics of a rural Missouri congregation. He functioned not as a dramatic savior arriving to banish evil, but simply as the administrative authority responsible for the ethical distribution of pantry resources. He noticed the tight cluster of bodies and the aggressive posture my mother maintained, taking in the escalating domestic dispute rapidly spilling onto church property. Linda instantly recognized the danger of a spiritual authority figure entering the fray. She shifted her stance, deploying her most practiced look of wounded matriarchal dignity. "Pastor Don," she began, her voice adopting a soft, pleading register. "I apologize for the disruption. This is strictly private family business. We are just working through a minor misunderstanding between sisters." The pastor did not smile. He placed the hymnals on a nearby chair and walked toward the folding table, his eyes scanning the documents laid out by Nancy. It stopped being only family business when the church put another woman's name on the delivery sheet. "Linda," he replied, his tone measured but unyielding. That single sentence fundamentally altered the atmosphere in the hall. The protective bubble my mother relied upon to shield her favored daughter shattered on contact with institutional accountability. The conflict was no longer a domestic squabble confined to a Sunday dinner table. It was a formal matter of organizational integrity. Carol Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, twisting the strap of her canvas tote bag. The retired nurse realized her own procedural failure was now exposed to her superior. "Pastor, I processed those initial intake forms." Carol admitted, her voice wavering slightly. "Denise came to me privately. She told me Marianne was deeply embarrassed about needing assistance for Caleb's care and specifically asked her sister to handle the paperwork to save face. I was trying to respect her privacy." Denise whipped her head toward the outreach coordinator, her eyes wide with frantic panic. The safety net was disintegrating rapidly. "Carol, you completely misunderstood me," Denise countered, her pitch rising defensively. "I never explicitly said Marianne sent me. I was just trying to explain the household dynamic." The soft-spoken nurse stiffened. A lifetime of charting medical records and dealing with difficult patients hardened her posture. "No, honey," Carol said, her voice dropping the polite, hesitant veneer. "You sat in my office, you cried, holding my hand, and you said those exact words to me." The blunt confirmation stripped away the final layer of plausible deniability. Denise's excuse of a simple misunderstanding collapsed, revealing the calculated manipulation she used to secure the donations. Nancy stepped forward, tapping her index finger against the oldest form in the sequence. "We do not need to read every detail," Nancy stated, keeping the focus strictly on the data. "But the justification narrative on this first application is the reason the committee approved the expedited grocery cards." The retired bank teller read a single line aloud from the intake summary. "Marianne is temporarily covering Caleb's care and needs food support until payroll clears." The words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. The depth of the fabrication was staggering. I never said that, I stated firmly, looking directly at Pastor Don, ensuring my voice carried the sterile authority of my profession. "I never experienced a single issue with district payroll clearing. I have never required emergency food support, and I absolutely never asked my sister to speak to this committee on my behalf." Denise folded her arms tightly across her chest, adopting a defensive, combative stance as she realized the room no longer believed her. "You have a title at the school, Marianne." She spat out the words laced with bitter resentment. "People listen when your name is attached to a request. They process things faster. I was just trying to cut through the red tape for Caleb. My professional title, the career I spent a decade building through quiet competence, was merely a skeleton key for her to unlock community vaults." The realization stung deeply, making me feel less like a beloved sister and more like a forged signature on a fraudulent check. Through the thin drywall dividing the hall from the sanctuary, the faint, rhythmic thumping of choir practice began signaling the slow return of normal church operations while my family fractured in the adjacent room. I turned back to the pastor, refusing to engage in a screaming match with Denise over motives. "Pastor Don, I request that the church records be formally corrected before any further family discussions take place. I said maintaining a strict focus on the administrative reality. I want my name permanently removed from these files." The pastor nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of the request. "I agree," he said. "Nancy and I will review the entire benevolence file this afternoon and halt all pending distributions linked to this household profile until we establish the truth." Carol offered a small, apologetic nod, signaling her shift from a neutral volunteer to an uneasy ally who realized she had been thoroughly played. My reliance on private problem-solving remained stubbornly intact. I successfully paused the aid and defended my name, but I still refused to explicitly disclose the 180 days of cafeteria payments I made for Caleb. I protected my nephew's dignity by keeping his school ledger out of the church dispute, but that silence left a dangerous tactical void. Denise still retained enough wiggle room to claim she was the primary generous caretaker forced into extreme measures by poverty, while I merely complained about paperwork. The pastor gathered the 3 older forms, handing them back to Nancy. He recognized his jurisdictional limits. He could correct church ledgers and freeze charitable assets, but he could not adjudicate the messy emotional guilt tearing my family apart. He looked at my sister delivering a mandate that promised a far more difficult reckoning. The pantry committee meets Wednesday before the community supper. Pastor Don stated his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Denise, you need to be there." Stepping out of the humid fellowship hall, the Missouri afternoon sun felt blindingly bright. The gravel parking lot crunched under my shoes as I walked toward my sedan, eager to put physical distance between myself and the institutional machinery of the church. I stopped short, realizing I was not alone. My father leaned against the passenger side door of my vehicle. Gary looked noticeably diminished, standing in the harsh daylight. The broad shoulders that carried decades of construction timber now slumped forward, and he kept his calloused hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded denim jacket. He studied the gravel near his boots, actively avoiding any direct eye contact with me. "Your mother sent me out here," he began, his voice carrying the rough, hesitant cadence of a man forced to deliver a message he did not believe in. "She wanted me to make sure you do not go too far with this committee business, Marianne. She thinks you are overreacting." I unlocked the car door, tossing my heavy tote bag onto the passenger seat. I did not raise my voice, preferring the sharp edge of quiet facts over a screaming match in a church parking lot. "Dad, I am not overreacting to a clerical error," I stated firmly. Denise forged my name to steal community resources. She lied to the outreach volunteers. Gary winced, shifting his weight uncomfortably against the metal door panel. He pulled one hand from his pocket, rubbing the back of his neck, a physical tell, indicating immense internal stress. He glanced around the empty parking lot, ensuring Linda was still occupied inside the building. "I know she lied, Marianne." He admitted the words, dropping into the space between us like heavy stones. "I saw it happen last month." I froze, my hand resting on the open car door. "You saw what happened?" I asked, my pulse quickening at the unexpected confession. My father stared at the tree line outlining the church property. "I drove over to Denise's rental house to fix a leaky faucet a few weeks ago. When I pulled up, Travis was unloading a white cardboard box from his truck. It had the same orange benevolence sticker on the side. I sat in my cab and watched him tear the tape off before Denise even walked outside. Travis reached into the box and pulled out a white church envelope. He shoved it into his jeans pocket and told Denise he was heading to the hardware store. The revelation fundamentally altered the geometry of the theft. The deceit was not merely a desperate mother stockpiling peanut butter for her son. The charity pipeline supplied flexible assets directly to an unemployed boyfriend. My father witnessed the interception of those assets and chose to remain silent. "Why did you not say anything, Dad?" I asked, the disappointment radiating through my chest. "You watched Travis pocket funds meant to feed your grandson." Gary looked down at his boots, his expression tightening with a mixture of shame and misplaced loyalty. "Your mother told me to leave it alone," he mumbled, offering the cowardly defense of an enabler. "Linda said Denise was embarrassed enough about needing the pantry boxes, and bringing it up would only humiliate her further. She thought keeping it quiet was kinder." The profound moral failure embedded in that sentence took my breath away. Keeping it quiet was kinder for the adults, I countered, my voice thick with grief. But Caleb was hungry enough to hoard a dinner roll in his pocket last night. My father flinched as if I had physically struck him. He possessed no counter-argument for the brutal reality of a hungry child. He turned away, shoulders hunched, and walked slowly toward his own truck, leaving the uncomfortable truth hanging in the humid air. Gary became the first family member to acknowledge the story was a fabrication, but his awareness lacked the courage required to confront Linda's aggressive shielding. He suspected the rot, but still chose the path of least resistance. Before I could start my engine, Carol Whitaker emerged from the side door of the fellowship hall, waving a piece of paper. She hurried across the gravel, looking far more resolute than she had during the confrontation with Denise. She motioned for me to follow her back toward the building entrance, shielding us from view. "I thought you should know this before the Wednesday meeting," Carol said, keeping her voice low. She held out a printed receipt. "The benevolence program requires us to track the categories purchased with the emergency grocery cards to ensure the funds are utilized appropriately. We pull the data directly from the vendor system." I took the thin slip of thermal paper, examining the itemized list. The top half detailed standard provisions reflecting a family struggling to make ends meet: canned soup, boxes of generic cereal, a gallon of milk. But the bottom half of the receipt painted a vastly different picture. The funds covered the purchase of 2 prepaid cellular phone minute cards and a pair of steel-toed men's work boots. The specific items triggered an immediate visual memory. During the tense Sunday dinner at my parents' house, Travis arrived briefly to pick up Denise. I distinctly remembered the pristine tan work boots he wore, contrasting sharply with his otherwise disheveled appearance. He had funded his footwear using the charity cards requested under my professional name, while Caleb saved bread in a napkin. Carol reached out, resting a warm hand on my arm. "I am so sorry I believed her story." Marianne, the retired nurse, offered her apology, carrying genuine remorse. "I should have verified the contact before processing the forms." She paused, offering a small, comforting smile. "Let me get you a cup of coffee from the kitchen before you drive back to the school." I accepted the gesture, following her into the quiet church kitchen. Carol poured dark roast coffee into a styrofoam cup, holding it out to me. The words "New Hope Ladies Circle" were printed crookedly along the curved white side in faded blue ink. Only after the kitchen door closed securely behind us did I allow my hands to shake. The adrenaline crash hit hard, leaving me physically trembling as the full scope of the betrayal settled in. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, grounding myself in the present moment. My instinct urged me to march back into the fellowship hall and nail the receipt to the bulletin board exposing Travis and Denise to the entire congregation. But revenge rarely solves the underlying crisis. Taking the receipt public would spark a chaotic gossip war, distracting the committee from the primary objective. "Carol, please keep this receipt secured in the official church file I requested," handing the paper back to her. "Do not share this information with the Sunday school circle or the choir. We cannot turn this into a neighborhood spectacle. Wednesday's meeting must focus entirely on protecting Caleb's access to food, not on punishing Travis for buying boots." My reliance on careful, measured responses remained firmly intact. The choice proved morally sound, preventing a messy public circus, but it left a tactical vulnerability. By refusing to leverage the explosive evidence immediately, I granted Denise 48 hours to prepare a counterattack. The consequences of that restraint arrived swiftly. Later that evening, as I reviewed budget spreadsheets in my quiet living room, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A single text message illuminated the screen, sent directly from Denise. The words carried no apology and no remorse, only a cold, calculated threat designed to shift the blame back onto my shoulders. "If the church cuts us off." Wednesday, Denise wrote her message dripping with venomous manipulation. "You can explain to Caleb why breakfast stops." Wednesday evening arrived, carrying the humid weight of a looming Midwestern storm. The fellowship hall at New Hope Baptist buzzed with low, tense energy hours before the scheduled community supper. Long folding tables were already draped in inexpensive plastic covers, waiting for the arrival of slow cookers and cornbread pans. The pantry committee convened in a small, brightly lit classroom adjacent to the main kitchen, seeking privacy before the congregation filled the building. The air felt thick, smelling faintly of old paper and the lingering scent of industrial floor wax. I took a seat near the whiteboard, observing the physical geometry of the room. Nancy Tate and Carol Whitaker anchored the far side of the table, projecting unified institutional authority. Vernon Pruitt stood quietly near the doorway, offering a silent, steady presence. Pastor Don Wilkes sat at the head of the table, a legal pad resting open before him. Across from the church officials sat my mother, Linda, her posture rigid and defensive. Denise occupied the chair beside her, actively twisting a paper tissue between her manicured fingers. Surprisingly, my father Gary was also present. He had defied Linda's explicit instructions to remain at home, sitting slightly apart from his wife, his gaze fixed firmly on the scuffed baseboards. The heavy classroom door swung open unceremoniously. Travis sauntered into the room, breaking the stifling silence. He wore a faded, dirty baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a stained T-shirt. He did not bother to remove the hat inside the church building, projecting a casual, arrogant disrespect for the proceedings. "I am here because it is my household, too," Travis announced, pulling a chair out with a loud screeching drag across the floor tiles. He slumped down, crossing his arms over his chest, daring anyone to challenge his presence. Nancy Tate refused to indulge the theatrical entrance. The retired bank teller possessed zero tolerance for grandstanding and navigated the meeting with brutal efficiency. She did not deliver a lengthy lecture on morality or community trust. She simply placed two specific items squarely in the center of the beige table, ensuring they rested fully visible under the harsh fluorescent lights. The first item was the forged benevolence form bearing my professional name. The second was the thermal vendor receipt Carol had shown me, tracking the purchase of the men's work boots and the prepaid phone minutes. The physical evidence stripped away the need for debate. Pastor Don leaned forward, interlacing his fingers, resting his forearms on the legal pad. The Benevolence Committee operates on a foundation of transparency and targeted assistance. The pastor began, his voice calm, but completely unyielding. Moving forward, the church will no longer issue flexible cash-equivalent grocery cards to this household. The potential for resource mismanagement is too high, and the unauthorized use of Marianne's name represents a severe breach of protocol. Denise gasped, pressing the shredded tissue to her eyes. The manufactured tears flowed instantly, attempting to drown the logical consequences in a flood of maternal victimhood. Linda immediately rushed to her defense, slamming a palm flat against the table. "You are making my daughter beg for canned goods," Linda challenged, her tone sharp with wounded pride. "She is a single mother trying to survive, and you are treating her like a common criminal over a simple misunderstanding about paperwork." The defense mechanism functioned exactly as I expected, shielding the golden child by attacking the institution. However, the dynamic in the room shattered unexpectedly from the quietest corner. Gary finally looked up from the baseboards. He did not raise his voice, but the gravelly, rough texture of his words cut through Linda's hysteria with absolute finality. "Linda, she already used Marianne's name." My father stayed his gaze, locking onto his wife. The entire room turned toward the aging construction worker, stunned by his sudden vocal intervention. Linda stared at her husband, her expression twisting from righteous anger into profound betrayal. Denise stopped crying mid-sob, looking genuinely terrified that her father had ceased providing his silent complicity. Travis, sensing the protective walls crumbling around his primary asset, leaned forward aggressively. He pointed a dirt-stained finger at the receipt resting near a stack of empty styrofoam chili bowls, waiting for the supper service. Those boots were for job interviews, Travis argued, offering a pathetic, transparent justification for the theft. "I needed them to secure steady work. You people are supposed to be helping a struggling family, and you pull funding over footwear." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, calling the church cheap and judgmental. "All this over a couple groceries and some boots," Travis scoffed, shaking his head in manufactured disbelief. The sheer audacity of minimizing identity theft and the misappropriation of child-centered charity funds hung heavily in the classroom. I did not engage with his bait. I maintained my focus entirely on securing the boundaries required to protect Caleb. I addressed the pastor directly, ignoring the venomous glares from my mother and sister. "I fully support restricting the aid to packed pantry boxes," I stated, my voice level and deliberate. "Furthermore, my name is permanently revoked from all current and future requests. I will not authorize any external household funding." Pastor Don nodded, writing a swift, decisive note on his legal pad. "Food support will continue," the pastor confirmed, finalizing the institutional verdict. "But it will strictly involve physical pantry boxes and the standard school backpack program designed directly for Caleb. No cash cards will be authorized. No adult pickup will be permitted without direct committee oversight. The immediate threat appeared resolved. I successfully severed the fraudulent pipeline protecting my professional reputation, while ensuring my nephew still had access to basic nutrition. By transferring the aid distribution to secure, transparent channels, I assumed the crisis was contained. The church stripped Denise of her unrestricted funding, terminating her ability to control the narrative of the generous, suffering mother. Gary had finally spoken up publicly, fracturing Linda's iron grip on the family story. It felt like a victory. It was a profound miscalculation. My methodical approach successfully neutralized the institutional theft, but it failed to anticipate the chaotic, vindictive nature of a narcissist stripped of their primary weapon. I assumed a controlled aid plan would force my sister to accept reality and stop the relentless family pressure. I believed the cold, hard facts presented on the table would end the dispute. As the meeting adjourned, Denise did not look at me with the embarrassment of a sibling caught in a lie. She looked at me with the cold, calculating fury of an adversary who had just had their ammunition confiscated. The donations were no longer under her control, reaching a false resolution that only shifted the battlefield. I had blocked her access to the church funds, but she possessed a far more potent piece of leverage living under her own roof. The storm broke later that evening, dumping sheets of heavy rain across Columbia. At 20 minutes past 9, my porch light flickered, illuminating the deluge outside. The doorbell rang, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the quiet of my house. I opened the front door, expecting a delayed package delivery. Instead, Denise stood on my welcome mat, shivering in the damp night air. Beside her stood Caleb, clutching his frayed blue school backpack tightly against his chest. In his other hand, he held a small, battered overnight bag. Denise did not ask to come inside. She looked at me, her expression devoid of any maternal warmth, replaced entirely by a cruel, triumphant spite. "Since you cut off his food," Denise stated, her voice slicing cleanly through the sound of the pouring rain, "you can feed him yourself." Driving rain lashed against the front of my house, the wind driving cold droplets across the covered porch. I stood frozen in the open doorway, staring at the chilling scene unfolding on my welcome mat. Denise offered no further explanation for the sudden nocturnal drop-off. She simply stepped backward, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders, preparing to abandon her son in the middle of a thunderstorm. Caleb remained perfectly still, clutching the frayed straps of his blue school backpack. He looked small, fragile, and entirely overwhelmed by the adult warfare raging above his head. The worn fabric of his bag dripped cold rainwater onto my woven entry rug, creating a slow, dark stain near my boots. I looked past my sister, peering through the sheets of rain toward the driveway. The headlights of my parents' sedan pierced the gloom, illuminating the wet asphalt. I could see the silhouette of my mother sitting rigidly behind the steering wheel. Linda kept the engine running, the exhaust pluming in the damp air, actively refusing to step out of the vehicle or acknowledge the transfer taking place on my porch. She was providing the getaway car, facilitating the abandonment while maintaining a cowardly physical distance from the messy reality of it. "Where is Travis?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the noise of the storm. "If you are struggling this much tonight, where is the man who lives in your house and eats the food provided by this community?" Denise scoffed, rolling her eyes in a gesture of profound irritation. "Do not start with me, Marianne." She snapped, her tone dripping with defensive venom. "Travis had to leave. I cannot deal with his temper and Caleb's sad face right now, not after you deliberately turned the entire church committee against us this evening." The audacity of her logic was staggering. She framed her inability to parent her own child as the direct result of my refusal to facilitate a felony fraud. She twisted my boundary into an act of cruelty, using her son's physical presence as a weapon to punish me for cutting off her illicit funding stream. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his sneakers squeaking wetly against the concrete. "Aunt Marianne," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind, "I have spelling homework due tomorrow. I did not bring my pajamas because Mom said you have money for everything and could just buy me new ones." The quiet, innocent statement shattered the remaining restraint, holding my anger in check. The fury broke silently inside my chest, a hot, blinding wave of indignation aimed entirely at the woman standing on my porch. Denise had not merely dropped him off out of desperation. She had actively coached him, filling his head with the narrative that I was a wealthy, endless resource obligated to provide for him because she refused to do so. She was grooming the next generation of the family to view me solely as a functional ATM. My instinct demanded I march Denise back to the car, drag Linda onto the porch, and force them to explain their catastrophic failures to this child. I wanted to scream until the neighbors called the police, but yelling at an unstable mother in a freezing rainstorm solves nothing, and it inflicts permanent psychological damage on the child trapped in the crossfire. My professional training, prioritizing the immediate physical safety of the minor, overrode my desperate need for boundary clarity. I stepped aside, opening the door wider to allow the cold, wet boy into the warmth of my hallway. "He can stay tonight," I told Denise, my voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register. "But you and I are going to talk first thing tomorrow morning at Mom's house." Denise offered a smirk that chilled me far more than the Missouri wind. "Fine," she answered, turning her back to walk toward the idling sedan. "But do not pretend you are not the one who wanted this, Marianne. You wanted to be the responsible one. Congratulations." She hurried down the steps, the car door slamming shut a moment later. The sedan reversed out of the driveway, leaving me standing alone with my nephew. This interaction constituted my second major tactical mistake. I protected Caleb immediately, making the correct moral choice, but I failed to force Denise to legally define the arrangement before she drove away. By allowing her to leave without establishing explicit temporary guardianship parameters in front of Linda, I provided my sister with the exact ambiguous silence she needed to manipulate the story by morning. I guided Caleb into the kitchen, handing him a warm towel to dry his hair. While he settled at the island, I pulled out my smartphone. I recognized the danger of the vague drop-off, so I attempted to establish a digital paper trail. I drafted a clear, concise text message and sent it simultaneously to Denise, Linda, and Gary. "Caleb is staying here for one night only, due to the weather and the late hour." I typed, ensuring the language remained factual and devoid of emotion. "I am dropping him off at your house before school tomorrow to discuss his care plan." The message provided temporary legal cover, confirming the brevity of the stay, but the reality of the situation remained heavily dictated by the chaotic whims of my family. I successfully protected the child from the immediate physical storm, but my compassion left me vulnerable to the looming narrative storm my sister was undoubtedly brewing in the passenger seat of our mother's car. The central conflict had officially mutated, shifting violently from a dispute over stolen donations into a terrifying battle over caregiving access and parental abandonment. Caleb sat quietly on a bar stool, his wet sneakers dangling above the linoleum floor. He unzipped the main compartment of his damp blue backpack, retrieving a crumpled spelling worksheet. As he pulled the folder free, 3 small metallic packages tumbled out of the bag, clattering onto the quartz countertop. I recognized the shiny wrappers instantly. They were premium protein snack packs routinely distributed by the elementary school's weekend backpack program, designed specifically to provide high-calorie nutrition for food-insecure students when the cafeteria was closed. They were intended exclusively for Caleb to eat at home. I picked up one of the silver packages, noticing a thick layer of black permanent marker scrawled across the bright nutritional label. I turned the snack pack over, my blood running cold, as I read the crude block letters written across the foil. "Do not eat. Travis." Morning broke over Columbia with a pale, washed-out light replacing the violent thunderstorm with a sullen gray chill. I woke early, preparing a hot bowl of cinnamon oatmeal for Caleb before methodically packing his lunchbox with a fresh turkey sandwich and an apple. He ate quietly, sitting at my kitchen island, swinging his legs, his demeanor cautious but visibly less strained than the night before. Alongside his lunchbox, I packed a separate brown paper grocery bag. Inside, I placed the 3 silver protein snack packs, specifically the ones bearing the crude black marker instructions. I did not mention them to Caleb. I simply zipped his backpack, handed him his coat, and drove him straight to my parents' house. Linda and Gary's kitchen smelled strongly of burnt toast and stale coffee when we walked through the back door. My mother stood near the stove, wearing her floral bathrobe, aggressively scraping a piece of blackened bread over the sink. Denise sat at the circular oak table, scrolling through her phone, nursing a mug of tea. She looked up as we entered, offering Caleb a tight, distracted smile that barely reached her eyes. The atmosphere felt heavy, saturated with the unspoken tension carrying over from the disastrous church meeting and the abrupt midnight drop-off. My father sat across from Denise, silently reading the local newspaper, his mug of black coffee resting untouched on the table beside him. I guided Caleb toward the hallway, ensuring he grabbed his jacket and his lunchbox. The school bus stops at the end of the block in 10 minutes, I told him, keeping my voice light and encouraging. Go wait by the front window, buddy. Once he was safely out of earshot, I turned back to the kitchen. I did not offer a polite morning greeting. I walked directly to the oak table and placed the crumpled brown paper bag near the center, separating my father's newspaper from Denise's phone. Reaching inside, I pulled out the 3 silver foil packages and laid them flat against the wood grain, ensuring the thick black marker faced upward. The overhead light caught the metallic sheen, highlighting the crude territorial scrawl. I need someone to explain why a child's school-provided weekend food is labeled for Travis. I demanded, my voice echoing cleanly off the kitchen cabinets. Denise dropped her phone against the tabletop, the plastic case making a sharp clacking sound. She glanced quickly at the packages, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before the practiced defensive mask slid into place. Caleb just misunderstood the situation, Denise deflected, waving her hand dismissively. Travis was organizing the pantry yesterday and must have written his name on those specific bars because he needs the extra protein for his workout routine. It is not a big deal, Marianne. You are blowing this completely out of proportion. The heavy door leading to the attached garage creaked open, interrupting her weak justification. Travis lumbered into the kitchen, wiping grease off his hands with a dirty shop rag. He took in the scene, glancing from the silver packages on the table to my rigid posture. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh, tossing the rag onto the counter. "Those protein bars taste like cardboard anyway," Travis scoffed, shaking his head. "I told the kid not to eat them because they are garbage, not because I wanted them. You people are losing your minds over a few stale snacks." His casual arrogance was nauseating. He felt entirely comfortable asserting dominance over a third grader's nutritional resources, and he expected the adults in the room to validate his behavior. I did not argue with him. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on my father, waiting for the patriarch to process the physical evidence sitting inches from his coffee mug. Gary slowly lowered the newspaper, folding it with deliberate care. He reached out with a calloused hand, picking up one of the foil packages. He turned it over, reading the black marker. "Do not eat. Travis." The lines around his mouth deepened, and the color seemed to drain from his weathered face. He looked at the snack pack, then looked directly at his oldest daughter. The quiet resignation he usually wore vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp clarity. "Did he take food from the boy?" Gary asked, his voice rough, dropping into a dangerous interrogative register. Denise did. "Travis take food that the school sent home for Caleb." Denise shrank back into her chair, opening her mouth to offer another excuse, but Linda intercepted the confrontation before it could escalate. My mother rushed over from the sink, placing herself physically between my father and my sister. "Gary, stop it," Linda commanded, her tone sharp and authoritative. "Everyone is exhausted from the drama last night. Marianne should not be marching in here and interrogating a struggling mother before school even starts. We are a family, not a courtroom." "I am not interrogating anyone, Mom," I countered, refusing to back down. "I am asking a very simple question. Why was Caleb told not to eat the food specifically packed to ensure he does not go hungry over the weekend? The school identifies vulnerable children and provides those exact snacks to bridge the gap. Why is an unemployed adult male claiming ownership of a child's emergency rations?" Denise stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "You have no children, Marianne," she spat, venom lacing every syllable. "You have absolutely no right to judge how I run my household or manage my pantry. You sit in your quiet, clean house and look down on us because you do not understand what it takes to survive." Linda placed a comforting hand on Denise's shoulder, turning her glare toward me. "You get to go home to quiet Marianne," my mother stated, delivering the ultimate enabling justification. "You have your peaceful life and your steady paycheck. Denise has to survive real life. Real life is messy and complicated. You cannot expect perfection when people are just trying to keep their heads above water." The defense was breathtaking in its moral bankruptcy. Linda was actively framing the theft of a child's food as an acceptable, necessary component of messy survival. I realized in that moment that explaining logic and ethics to my mother was a catastrophic waste of time. She would always contort reality to protect her favored daughter. My reliance on presenting facts, hoping they would eventually matter to her, proved entirely ineffective. I did not take the snack packs back. I did not hide them in the brown paper bag. I left them resting squarely on the oak table, a tangible monument to the dysfunction rotting the core of this family. I turned my attention exclusively to the only person in the room showing a flicker of genuine conscience. "I am leaving these right here, Dad," I told Gary, maintaining eye contact. "You need to decide today what kind of man you are. You need to decide whether you are going to protect your grandson or if you are going to continue protecting Denise's fabricated story. You cannot do both anymore." Gary stared at the silver packages. Beside his hand, the mug of black coffee sat entirely untouched, a thin, murky skin forming across the cooling surface of the liquid. He did not answer me, but his silence felt different this time. It felt heavy with the painful realization that his silent complicity had enabled a predator to target his own flesh and blood under his roof. Travis stepped forward, crossing his arms aggressively, his hostility shifting from annoyance to genuine threat. He recognized the shift in Gary's demeanor and identified me as the catalyst, dismantling his comfortable parasitic arrangement. The garage mechanic dropped his casual smirk, adopting a menacing posture. "You keep pushing like this," Travis sneered, pointing a grease-stained finger directly at my face. "You keep digging into our business, and Denise will go right back up to that fellowship hall and tell the whole church you tried to take her kid away from her." The threat hung in the kitchen air, thick and toxic, as I turned my back on Travis and walked out of my parents' house. I did not engage with his petty extortion. I drove straight to the district nutrition office, seeking the structured, sterile environment of spreadsheets and federal lunch compliance guidelines. By noon, however, the toxicity breached my professional sanctuary. The digital strike did not arrive as a private text message or a hushed phone call. It arrived as a public broadcast designed to inflict maximum collateral damage. I sat at my desk reviewing the weekly dairy vendor invoices when my smartphone vibrated against the laminate surface. A notification from Facebook illuminated the screen. I rarely utilize social media, preferring to keep my personal and professional lives strictly compartmentalized. My mother and sister, however, treated the platform as a primary battleground for managing their public relations. I tapped the icon, opening the application. Denise had published a new status update exactly 30 minutes prior. The post lacked specific names, but the intended target was glaringly obvious to anyone embedded in the local Missouri community network. Some relatives think buying a child lunch gives them the right to control a mother. Denise wrote her words carefully, crafted to project the image of a fiercely protective matriarch under siege. Help should come with love, not strings attached. The reframing was a masterpiece of narcissistic manipulation. She completely erased the forged benevolence documents, the stolen grocery cards, and the intercepted school snack packs. In a single sentence, Denise hijacked the 180 days of cafeteria payments I made, transferring them from an act of quiet compassion into evidence of a hostile power grab. She weaponized the core truth of the title to destroy my reputation before I could defend myself. The comment section beneath the post blossomed rapidly, a digital echo chamber of enablement. Aunt Beverly weighed in, immediately typing, "Praying for you and Caleb," followed by 3 folded hand emojis. 2 women from the New Hope Choir offered vague words of encouragement about staying strong against toxic family members. The most damaging addition arrived via a shared post. Travis shared Denise's status onto his own timeline, adding his own venomous commentary. People with school jobs think they own families, he typed, cementing the connection between my career and the alleged abuse of power. A sharp knock interrupted my rising panic. Alma Reed pushed my office door open, stepping inside and quietly pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The cafeteria manager did not look angry, but her posture was rigid, conveying a grave, serious intent. She leaned against the filing cabinet, sliding a thin nylon cafeteria hairnet off her wrist. She twisted the mesh fabric tightly between her fingers, snapping it like a rubber band as she spoke. "I saw the post," Alma stated, her voice dropping into a low, pragmatic register. "The entire ladies' circle saw the post, Marianne. The school secretaries are whispering about it in the break room." I bristled instinctively, my defensive walls rising. "Alma, I cannot stop my sister from lying on the internet." I countered, my tone sharper than intended. "I am not going to drag a third grader's confidential meal account onto a public forum just to win a Facebook argument. My supervisor already confirmed that any disclosure of student financial data violates district policy. My hands are tied by federal regulations." Alma held up a hand, halting my defensive spiral. "You did right by the boy, Marianne. I know that and you know that." She paused, untwisting the hairnet, letting the elastic snap softly against her palm. "But you waited too long to say what was yours and what wasn't. You let them spin a narrative in the dark, and now they are using the sunlight to blind everyone else. When you deal with people who lie for a living, vague public accusations can severely damage the trust this community places in your school nutrition role. Parents need to believe you are an impartial advocate, not a manipulative aunt hoarding lunch money for leverage." The veteran cafeteria manager was not blaming me for the abuse, but she was actively warning me that my continued reliance on private correction was failing spectacularly. By prioritizing the preservation of peace over the establishment of a public boundary, I allowed Denise to dictate the terms of engagement. My sister recognized that I possessed the facts, so she moved the fight to a platform governed entirely by emotion and unchecked sympathy. I needed to adapt my strategy, abandoning the ineffective habit of silent problem-solving. I unlocked my phone, pulling up Denise's post. I stared at the blinking cursor in the comment field, battling my ingrained aversion to public conflict. I drafted a response, deleting it twice before settling on a statement that felt authentic yet legally secure. I focused entirely on my own boundaries, refusing to confirm or deny the cafeteria payments that involved Caleb. No adult may use my name to request donations. I typed, my thumbs moving deliberately across the glass screen. "I will always support children eating through proper private channels." I hit send, dropping the phone back onto the desk. The comment was plain devoid of dramatic flair or emotional exclamation points. It offered a limited, child-safe boundary that directly contradicted the narrative of controlling manipulation without violating district privacy mandates. I made my first public correction, stepping into the arena I had avoided my entire life. The digital victory was exceptionally brief. 3 minutes later, I refreshed the page to check for replies. The comment was gone. Denise, actively monitoring her timeline, deleted my statement the moment it appeared, utilizing her administrative control over her own page to silence the dissenting truth. She curated her victimhood with ruthless efficiency, ensuring the flying monkeys only consumed the approved diet of lies. The erasure stung, a sharp reminder that correcting the record on hostile territory rarely yields justice. I hated that Caleb's hunger had mutated into a piece of public theater, even without his name explicitly mentioned in my reply. My attempt at a public boundary demonstrated personal growth, but it proved woefully inadequate to halt my sister's escalating campaign. Denise realized that digital sympathy offered a powerful shield, but she required a physical audience to solidify her martyr status. The phone on my desk rang loudly, startling me out of my strategic calculations. The caller ID displayed the main office number for New Hope Baptist Church. I picked up the receiver, expecting to speak with Nancy Tate regarding the paperwork adjustments. "Marianne, it is Pastor Don." The familiar, pragmatic voice echoed through the earpiece, sounding weary and strained. "I need to inform you about a change to the schedule tonight." I gripped the phone tightly, bracing for the inevitable fallout. "What happened, Pastor?" "Denise contacted the church office an hour ago." Pastor Don explained, his tone conveying a deep reluctance to deliver the news. "She formally requested 5 minutes to speak at the microphone during the Wednesday community supper, right before I explained the new pantry restriction changes to the congregation." The ambient hum of the New Hope Fellowship Hall swelled steadily as the Wednesday evening crowd gathered. Fluorescent lights reflected off long plastic-covered tables laden with heavy ceramic crockpots. The rich, savory scent of homemade chili and warm cornbread mingled with the sweet aroma of sugary iced tea, creating a veneer of small-town politeness that masked the impending collision. The Pantry Committee originally scheduled a brief administrative announcement regarding new security protocols, aiming to handle the adjustments quietly after the plates were cleared. That strategy dissolved the moment my family walked through the double doors. Denise arrived flanking my mother Linda, who marched into the room projecting an aura of wounded dignity. Travis trailed behind them, his posture radiating a hostile, restless energy. But the sight that genuinely stopped my breath was Caleb. My nephew shuffled alongside his mother, gripping his frayed blue school backpack tightly against his side. His presence immediately complicated the tactical geometry of the room. I anticipated a brutal public confrontation with adults prepared to combat the false narrative Denise planned to deliver at the microphone. Bringing a third grader into a room where his basic survival needs were about to be weaponized represented a terrifying escalation. I intercepted the group near the metal coat rack, positioning myself physically between Denise and the gathering congregation. I kept my voice low, ensuring the confrontation remained localized. "Caleb should not be in this room for an adult discussion, Denise," I stated, locking eyes with my sister. "You know exactly what the committee plans to address tonight. Exposing him to a public debate about his food security is unacceptable." Denise offered a defiant smirk, tossing her jacket over a metal hook. "Then do not make it ugly, Marianne." She countered, her tone laced with challenging arrogance. "You caused this mess. If you cannot handle the fallout that sounds like a personal failure..." My mother stepped up, functioning as the reliable enforcer for her favored child. Linda crossed her arms tightly, defending the inclusion of the boy. "If you need to tell your version of the truth so badly, Marianne, tell it in front of the child you claim to love so much," Linda challenged loudly enough for a nearby usher to glance in our direction. "You cannot be a good aunt and a public accuser at the same time. Pick a lane." The blatant emotional manipulation triggered a profound wave of disgust. They were actively utilizing Caleb as a human shield, calculating that my professional instinct to protect a minor would force my silence. They wagered that I would absorb a devastating public lie rather than traumatize the boy by correcting the record in his presence. The wager was incredibly accurate. I felt the familiar urge to retreat, scanning the exit doors, calculating how quickly I could walk away from the fellowship hall and surrender the narrative entirely to avoid hurting Caleb. Before I could concede the battle, Pastor Don materialized from the kitchen hallway, smoothly intercepting the escalating standoff. He recognized the volatility of the situation and intervened, utilizing his authority to defuse the immediate threat. "The youth group is setting up a movie in the back room before supper begins," the pastor announced, addressing Caleb directly with a warm, reassuring smile. "We have a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies waiting back there. Why do you not head over and grab a good seat, buddy?" Caleb's eyes brightened instantly at the mention of cookies. He looked up at his mother, eager for permission to escape the suffocating tension radiating from the adults. Denise hesitated, her jaw tightening visibly. She recognized the tactical disadvantage of losing her physical shield. If Caleb left the room, she faced the congregation without the visual prop that guaranteed maximum sympathy. "Just stay here with me, Caleb," Denise instructed, her hand dropping heavily onto the boy's shoulder, anchoring him in place. "We will eat together soon." The command was undeniably cruel, prioritizing her public performance over his comfort. The stalemate stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before the dynamic unexpectedly ruptured. "Let the boy go," Gary ordered. My father stood near the edge of the coat rack, separating himself from the unified front maintained by Linda and Denise. He did not yell, but the gravelly weight of his command carried absolute finality. He reached out gently, pulling Caleb's backpack from his small hands. "Go watch the movie, son," Gary said, offering a rare encouraging nod. "I will save you a plate of chili." Linda whipped her head toward her husband, her expression contorting into pure, furious disbelief. Gary's intervention represented his clearest definitive side change to date. He refused to allow Denise to utilize the child as a prop in her theatrical production. Travis muttered a string of curses under his breath, leaning against the drywall and complaining that everyone was being played by the church leadership. Caleb did not wait for a second confirmation. He practically sprinted toward the youth room, eager to distance himself from the toxic atmosphere. Gary walked over to the row of folding chairs near the wall. He gently placed Caleb's worn blue backpack underneath the seat I had claimed earlier. The frayed bag rested near my shoes, serving as a poignant physical reminder of the hungry child trapped at the center of the adult deception. The final public scene was now unavoidable. My family could no longer hide behind private kitchen arguments or manipulate digital timelines on social media. My refusal to speak while Caleb remained present established a firm boundary that paid off. By enforcing my child privacy instinct publicly, instead of retreating silently, I forced Denise to fight her battle on equal footing without hiding behind a minor. However, enforcing that boundary carried a significant emotional cost. I accepted that protecting Caleb required me to appear cold and clinical to the congregation members who craved a dramatic emotional accusation. I understood that my stoicism might be misinterpreted as guilt by a room eager to support a weeping mother. I traded public sympathy for a child's peace of mind, a moral trade-off I was willing to make every single time. The fellowship hall settled as the attendees grabbed their food and found their seats. Pastor Don stepped toward the front of the room, adjusting the microphone stand near the dessert table, preparing to address the benevolence protocol adjustments. He carried the thin manila folder containing the forged documents, intending to present the facts methodically and quietly. Denise recognized the window of opportunity closing. She knew that once the pastor explained the new restrictions, her narrative would collapse under institutional weight. She needed to strike first, relying on the element of surprise to hijack the room's emotional current. She believed her practiced victimhood could still overpower the dry administrative facts waiting in the pastor's folder. Before Pastor Don could utter a single word of introduction, Denise pushed her chair back and stood up. She did not walk to the microphone. She turned to face the crowded tables, projecting her voice across the room with desperate theatrical volume. "I need everyone to know why my son's food was cut off," Denise declared, her voice trembling with practiced outrage. The clatter of silverware against ceramic bowls ceased instantly. Conversations sputtered and died, leaving a heavy, expectant silence hovering over the fellowship hall. Denise stood near the folding table, laden with homemade sheet cakes and brownies, refusing to utilize the microphone. Bypassing the audio equipment served a distinct psychological purpose. Shouting over the ambient noise of a crowded room projects an aura of raw desperation and authentic emotional distress. She commanded the attention of 50 congregation members, relying entirely on the performative volume of her victimhood. "I stand here today as a struggling single mother," Denise announced, her voice shaking with manufactured vulnerability. "I am being harshly judged by my own sister, a woman who collects a comfortable school salary and has absolutely no children of her own to support. She does not understand the sacrifices required to keep a roof over a boy's head." My mother Linda sat rigidly at a nearby table, nodding vigorously in agreement. Aunt Beverly reached into her purse, extracting a floral tissue, dabbing dramatically at her dry eyes before Denise even finished constructing her opening premise. The flying monkeys were actively performing their designated roles, reinforcing the narrative of the persecuted matriarch. Travis leaned heavily against the pale beige drywall, crossing his muscular arms over his chest, his expression shifting into a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He enjoyed the spectacle, feeding off the negative attention directed squarely at me. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly on the plastic table cover. A forensic compliance officer understands that interrupting a liar midway through their performance only validates their chaos. You let them speak, allowing them to confidently stack their fabricated blocks until the structure becomes impossibly top-heavy. I waited patiently for Denise to overplay her hand. She stopped church help because she wanted all the credit for feeding Caleb. Denise declared, escalating the accusation, relying heavily on the social media narrative she had seeded earlier that day. She wants everyone to believe she is a savior, and she is willing to starve her own nephew just to prove a point. The declaration hung in the humid air of the fellowship hall, practically daring me to challenge it. I pushed my chair back, the metal legs scraping lightly against the linoleum. I stood up tall and straight, meeting the gaze of the congregation members staring in my direction. "No," I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the room. It was not a polished oratorical boom. It carried the steady, unyielding resonance of a woman establishing a permanent boundary. I stopped my name from being used to commit fraud. The blunt, factual correction landed with the force of a physical strike. I turned my focus toward the front of the room, acknowledging the institutional authority present. "Pastor Don, I will not discuss a child's private school account in a public forum today or any other day," I asserted, ensuring my professional firewall remained intact. "But I absolutely will discuss the unauthorized use of my own name on official church documents." Pastor Don recognized the cue. He did not launch into a lengthy sermon or initiate a chaotic slideshow presentation. He stepped out from behind the microphone stand, approaching a small, empty folding table positioned near the center aisle. He opened the thin manila folder he carried, placing a single sheet of paper flat on the surface. It was the original benevolence intake request, displaying my name forged clearly on the household contact line. Nancy Tate, the retired bank teller, stepped forward, functioning as the secondary administrator of truth. She approached the same table, placing a small, narrow strip of thermal paper directly beside the forged intake form. The printed receipt clearly documented the purchase of the men's steel-toed work boots and the prepaid cellular phone minutes using community grocery funds. The two physical artifacts rested under the fluorescent lights, anchoring the dispute entirely in undeniable evidence. Denise stared at the documents, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The fabricated narrative of the starving single mother disintegrated instantly upon contact with the receipt for construction footwear. She realized her emotional manipulation held zero currency against a printed ledger. "You are choosing paperwork over your own nephew." Denise sputtered, her voice cracking as panic replaced her initial arrogance. "You care more about protecting an office form than you care about a boy having a meal." The desperate pivot failed to gain traction. The room was already processing the discrepancy. Aunt Beverly paused her dramatic weeping, staring blankly ahead. A metal serving spoon resting in her chili bowl slowly sank into the red liquid, slipping beneath the surface unnoticed while she processed the revelation. The congregation understood exactly what the receipt implied. The final devastating blow to my sister's credibility arrived from an unexpected ally. Carol Whitaker stood up from a table near the back of the room. The soft-spoken retired nurse usually avoided conflict at all costs, prioritizing harmony and polite interactions. Tonight she refused to allow her compassion to be exploited any longer. Denise came to my office and explicitly told me Mary Ann asked her to handle the benevolence forms Carol confessed addressing the silent room. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away. Denise claimed her sister was too proud to ask for help directly. I believed her story because I trusted the family. I was wrong to process those documents without verifying the contact. I enabled a lie. The public apology fundamentally altered the geometry of the confrontation. The congregation, previously leaning toward sympathy for a weeping mother, suddenly realized they were victims of a coordinated scam. Denise lost absolute control of the church narrative. The donations referenced in the title of this dispute were publicly redefined in real time. They were no longer viewed as necessary charity directed toward me, but rather as illicit assets secured through my stolen professional identity. I felt incredibly exposed, standing under the bright lights absorbing the stares of 50 community members. But this exposure was entirely chosen and strictly limited to the adult deception. I corrected my ineffective lifelong pattern of private fixing, abandoning the futile hope that backroom conversations could cure public slander. The boundary was finally established, plainly and loudly. Travis, realizing the protective shield surrounding Denise was evaporating completely, pushed off the drywall. His arrogant smirk mutated into a defensive sneer, recognizing that the receipt sitting on the table implicated him directly in the theft. He marched toward the center aisle, attempting to reclaim control of the room through sheer aggressive volume. "Those boots helped me get steady work," Travis shouted, gesturing wildly toward the thermal paper. "You all ate because of the paychecks I brought home. I am providing for that kid while you sit around passing judgment," Travis yelled, attempting to legitimize his theft by framing it as a heroic contribution to the household economy. His explosive outburst completely shattered the remaining decorum in the fellowship hall. The congregation fell into a stunned silence, staring at the aggressively defensive man standing in the center aisle. Vernon Pruitt, the elderly deacon who drove the delivery van, moved with surprising speed. He stepped smoothly between Travis and the folding table, acting as a quiet, imposing physical barrier to protect the documents resting on the surface. He did not say a word, simply planting his feet and crossing his arms, signaling that the intimidation tactics would not work on church property. Pastor Don did not retreat. He matched Travis' steady gaze, refusing to be bullied. "Nobody here approved benevolence cards for your boots," Travis the pastor stated, his voice radiating absolute institutional authority. "The congregation donates those funds specifically to ensure children and vulnerable families do not go hungry. They are not a slush fund to subsidize your employment search." Travis scoffed, waving a dismissive hand toward my sister. "Denise knew I needed them," he countered, throwing her under the bus without a moment of hesitation. She handed me the envelope. "We figured Marianne had plenty of cash sitting in her fancy school account anyway, so it was not like anyone was actually hurting." The immediate betrayal struck Denise like a physical blow. Her eyes widened in sheer panic as she realized her partner had just publicly admitted to premeditated theft while simultaneously attempting to shift the liability onto her shoulders. "I did not know he used the card that way," Denise stammered, scrambling to distance herself from the thermal receipt. "I thought he was just picking up extra groceries for Caleb. I never authorized boots." Her frantic backpedaling was a transparent, desperate pivot. I stared at my sister, recognizing the familiar pattern of avoiding accountability by playing the bewildered victim. I did not raise my voice, avoiding the chaotic energy Travis introduced into the room. "You knew enough to let my name stay on the form, Denise," I said, stripping away her final excuse. "You knew the requests were fraudulent the moment you submitted them. You may not have swiped the card for the boots, but you built the pipeline that paid for them." Denise opened her mouth to argue, but no sound emerged. She looked frantically toward the table, seeking a lifeline from her usual defenders. My mother immediately recognized the distress signal. Linda gripped her paper cup of iced tea so tightly the thin wax-coated cardboard began to buckle. The plastic lid popped off, sending a wave of sweet brown liquid spilling over her knuckles and dripping onto the linoleum floor. She ignored the mess, preparing to launch into a passionate defense of her daughter's fragile state of mind. "Linda, stop." The command originated from the back of the room. Gary stood near the coat rack, his posture remarkably rigid. It was not a loud, booming shout. It was a low, definitive statement carrying the weight of a man who had finally reached the absolute limit of his tolerance for deception. He looked at his wife, his expression devoid of the usual quiet compliance. "Do not defend this." Gary added, his voice rough but steady. "Do not make another excuse for them. It is over." Linda froze, staring at her husband in profound shock. The public reprimand from Gary severed her ability to manage the narrative. Without his silent backing, her matriarchal authority evaporated. She looked down at her sticky, wet hands, utterly defeated. At a nearby table, Aunt Beverly slowly lowered her cloth napkin to her lap. She did not offer another prayerful comment or attempt to soothe the tension. She simply watched the collapse of the family facade, her silence speaking volumes. Pastor Don recognized the decisive shift in the room. He seized the momentum to establish the new operational reality. The church will continue providing necessary food support to Caleb. The pastor announced, ensuring the congregation understood that compassion remained the priority. However, the delivery mechanism changes immediately. We will utilize restricted pantry boxes containing only essential dry goods. Furthermore, we will coordinate directly with the district school backpack partnership. There will be no more cash equivalent cards issued to this household. No adult pickup will be authorized without explicit committee approval. And Marianne's name is permanently scrubbed from the registry. The ruling dismantled the scam completely. Denise could still accept help if she truly needed it to feed her son, but she could no longer harvest praise or siphon flexible resources built upon a lie. Travis lost his primary access to unregulated community assets, immediately reducing his status within the household dynamic. I refused to argue with Travis or attempt to solve the entirety of Denise's dysfunctional life. I stayed strictly within the parameters I could realistically enforce, focusing entirely on protecting Caleb's food security and clearing my professional name. Travis let out a harsh, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disgust. "So the kid gets food, but nobody trusts us with it." Travis sneered, his gaze sweeping over the silent congregation. "Real Christian of you people." His attempt to shame the room failed spectacularly. The congregation members looked back at him with cold, assessing eyes. They understood that Travis knowingly benefited from stolen funds and that Denise knowingly orchestrated the fraud using my identity. The public excuse my mother tried to sell completely collapsed under the weight of the evidence and Gary's final intervention. The question of who drove the misuse was answered, leaving a much deeper, more painful question about what kind of family relationship could possibly survive after the room turned so definitively. Seeing Travis immediately turn the blame onto Denise complicated my anger. I watched my sister shrink physically under his accusation, realizing she was trapped in a toxic partnership of her own making. The observation did not erase the betrayal I felt regarding the forged paperwork, but it added a layer of tragic understanding to her desperate manipulations. Denise, unable to endure the suffocating judgment of the fellowship hall, turned sharply on her heel. She marched toward the hallway leading to the youth room, desperate to retrieve Caleb and escape the building. She needed her human shield back to validate her role as a mother. Before she could reach the door handle, Pastor Don stepped into the aisle, blocking her path. "Caleb is finishing his movie," the pastor said, his voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable undertone of protective authority. "Let him have 10 more minutes without this." The heavy double doors of the fellowship hall swung shut, muffling the ambient chatter of the congregation returning to their chilly suppers. Stepping out onto the concrete landing, the cool night air felt remarkably clean. The torrential rain had finally ceased, leaving behind the sharp metallic scent of wet gravel and damp asphalt. Puddles reflected the yellow glow of the security lights, illuminating the sparse parking lot. Travis stormed toward his battered pickup truck, his boots splashing aggressively through the standing water. He did not wait for my sister. He yanked the driver's side door open, climbing inside with violent, jerky movements. The metal door slammed shut with a concussive bang that echoed across the property, causing several late-arriving church members to turn their heads in alarm. The engine roared to life, tires spinning against the wet gravel as he peeled out of the lot, leaving Denise standing entirely alone under the protective canvas awning. Denise gripped Caleb's frayed blue school backpack tightly against her chest, holding it like a physical barrier. The arrogant, combative posture she maintained inside the hall had vanished completely. In the stark exterior lighting, she looked exhausted, hollowed out, and undeniably cornered. The toxic partnership she relied upon had just publicly fractured, leaving her exposed and vulnerable without the safety net of illicit community funds. My mother emerged from the building, rushing toward the awning with a frantic protective energy. Linda reached out, attempting to gather Denise into a comforting embrace, eager to smother the humiliation with maternal enabling. Before she could make contact, Gary stepped between them. He did not yell, but his physical presence blocked Linda's path. "Go wait in the car, Linda," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "We are done performing for tonight." Linda stiffened her face, flushing with indignation. She hated losing control of the narrative, especially in a public setting. She glared at her husband, then shifted her hostile gaze toward me. "This family used to handle things quietly." Linda hissed, her voice trembling with misplaced resentment before she turned sharply and marched toward their idling sedan. I ignored my mother, focusing entirely on the young boy standing beside me. Caleb held my hand loosely, his small fingers sticky from the chocolate chip cookies he consumed in the youth room. I guided him across the damp concrete toward his mother. Before completing the handoff, I knelt down on the wet pavement, bringing myself level with his eye line. I adjusted the collar of his jacket, ensuring he felt secure. "Breakfast will be there on Monday, buddy," I promised him, keeping my voice steady and warm. "You do not have to worry about any of this adult stuff. It is all handled." I did not explain the logistics of the new restricted pantry boxes. I did not mention the forged signatures or detail who had been paying his cafeteria balance since August. A third grader does not need to navigate the treacherous waters of parental deceit or financial fraud. He simply needed to know that the adults in his life had secured his next meal. Caleb nodded slowly, digesting the reassurance. He looked toward the glass doors of the fellowship hall, his expression serious. "Are the youth room cookies always chocolate chip?" he asked, his priority perfectly aligned with his age. I smiled, brushing a stray piece of hair from his forehead. Usually, I answered, "Sometimes they have snickerdoodles." I stood up, transferring his hand to Denise. She did not look at me immediately, keeping her eyes fixed on the wet gravel. "You could have warned me he would make it worse," Denise whispered, her voice barely audible over the idling engine of our parents' car. She referred to Travis, explicitly acknowledging that his explosive outburst had incinerated her remaining credibility. "I tried to talk to you before you made it public." "Denise," I replied, maintaining a firm, unemotional boundary. "You chose the microphone, I chose the paperwork." She offered no counter-argument. The stark reality of her choices offered no room for further manipulation. I watched her zip Caleb's blue backpack completely shut, securing the remaining zippers before she led him toward the passenger side of my father's car. Gary lingered near the awning, watching them walk away. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his denim jacket, looking remarkably old and tired in the yellow security lighting. "I should have spoken up sooner, Marianne," he admitted, staring at the puddles reflecting the parking lot lights. "When I saw Travis taking that envelope, I should have stopped it right then." I looked at my father, acknowledging the painful truth of his confession. "Yes," I answered, offering no comforting platitudes. "You should have." I resisted the deeply ingrained urge to over-explain my position or offer a lengthy, heartfelt monologue about generational trauma and healing. I preserved my emotional energy, keeping the boundary incredibly short and precise. The truth had finally surfaced, but the victory felt profoundly hollow. I grieved the reality that honesty only arrived after catastrophic public damage forced their hands rather than emerging organically from genuine family trust. The immediate consequences of that night rippled through the following weeks, reshaping the entire household dynamic. Without access to the unrestricted cash equivalent grocery cards, the financial utility of the relationship collapsed. Travis packed his belongings and moved out of Denise's rental property less than 14 days later. Stripped of the illicit funding pipeline, his parasitic attachment to my sister simply evaporated. Denise, forced to navigate reality without her primary enabler, eventually applied for official state-subsidized meal assistance. She completed the necessary paperwork with the direct guidance of the district school liaison, avoiding my office entirely. The meal support system returned to its proper fundamental purpose, ensuring Caleb ate hot food without requiring him to serve as a prop in an adult performance. I established a permanent boundary. I would support my nephew strictly through official transparent systems, but I would never again function as a secret bank account or a silent witness to their dysfunction. A quiet routine settled over my life in the aftermath of the fellowship hall confrontation. The chaotic, frantic energy that defined my family interactions faded, replaced by a sterile, manageable distance. Then, exactly 1 week after the committee meeting, my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed the main line for New Hope Baptist Church. I picked up the receiver, expecting a routine follow-up question regarding the new pantry protocols. "Marianne, it is." "Nancy Tate." The retired bank teller announced, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine excitement. "Someone just contacted the Benevolence Committee. They want to make a significant financial contribution to help the whole school lunch fund, but they insist on one very specific condition. Nancy paused, letting the suspense build for a fraction of a second. They will only write the check if no child's name is ever mentioned. Fluorescent lights hummed over the polished wooden dais at the district administration building, casting a sterile glow across the room. I sat in the back row of the folding chairs next to Alma Reed, listening to the rhythmic drone of the monthly school board agenda. The meetings usually involved tedious debates over bus routes and facility maintenance contracts. Tonight, the superintendent read a brief, unadorned statement into the desktop microphone. An anonymous community member had submitted a cashier check to the district nutrition fund. The contribution carried specific, strict parameters. The money was designated to clear every negative meal balance at Caleb's elementary school. No individual family would be identified. No child would ever know a debt existed. The board accepted the funds with a unanimous vote, the gavel striking the woodblock with a sharp, definitive crack. A gentle nudge from Alma drew my attention. The veteran cafeteria manager offered a knowing, approving smile before returning her focus to the printed agenda in her lap. The sheer relief of hearing a structural solution replace a secret burden felt physically light. My nephew and dozens of his classmates were shielded from the stigma of alternate meals through a system that demanded zero gratitude from the recipients. The identity of the benefactor surfaced 2 days later. The revelation occurred in the gravel parking lot of New Hope Baptist Church following a brief committee follow-up regarding the new pantry protocols. Vernon Pruitt, the quiet elderly deacon who drove the delivery van, intercepted me near my sedan. He wore his usual faded denim overalls and carried a worn leather-bound Bible. Vernon did not boast or demand recognition for the generous act. He leaned against the hood of his truck and looked out toward the highway traffic tracing the fading sunlight across the Missouri horizon. Vernon described growing up in a house where money was scarce and pride was rigid. I remember being a boy with an empty tray standing in a cafeteria line while the adults talked too loudly about who owed what. Vernon murmured, his gravelly voice thick with old memories. He looked at me, his eyes bright and unwavering. Children should eat without owing adults a performance. The profound simplicity of his statement stripped away my professional armor. I thanked the deacon, shaking his weathered hand, before climbing into my vehicle. Only after I shut the car door and turned the key in the ignition did the tears finally fall. I wept for the terrified little boy Vernon used to be, and the anxious nephew I had tried so hard to protect from the very same humiliation. 6 weeks passed before I returned to my parents' ranch house. The invitation for Sunday dinner arrived without passive-aggressive guilt trips or hidden agendas. I drove up the familiar driveway, noting the notable absence of Travis and his rusted pickup truck. A single white cardboard benevolence box sat neatly near the front door. The orange inventory sticker bore Denise's name in clear black ink, reflecting the new transparent reality of her household support. The church provided the dry goods, but the deception was permanently erased. Stepping inside the atmosphere felt remarkably different. The dining table was set for 5 instead of a sprawling, chaotic crowd. My phone remained in my purse until I deliberately placed it face down on the corner of the table, establishing a silent physical boundary. Gary did not retreat to the living room recliner to hide behind a muted baseball game. My father stood near the kitchen island, wearing a cloth apron, transferring warm dinner rolls from a baking sheet into a woven basket. He functioned as an active participant rather than a cowardly shadow. Denise sat quietly next to Caleb, helping him unfold a paper napkin. The boy looked rested and far less guarded. His blue school backpack hung over the back of his wooden chair, the zippers clean and fully functional without any crude duct tape repairs visible. He reached into the woven basket and took 2 dinner rolls. He buttered the first one, taking a large bite. The second roll remained resting openly on his ceramic plate. He did not fold it into a napkin. He did not shove it into his pocket to hoard against future hunger. The visual proof of his newfound food security anchored my resolve, proving the painful confrontation had yielded a tangible victory. Linda brought the pot roast to the table, taking her usual seat. She served the meat in silence, the old performative matriarchal energy noticeably absent. She cleared her throat twice, looking down at her ice water. Denise has been doing so much better this month. Linda started attempting to salvage a fraction of her previous narrative. She paused, her mouth tightening into a thin, uncomfortable line. She glanced at me, the effort of speaking the truth, visibly straining her features. Marianne helped more than we admitted, she said awkwardly. The partial apology hung over the savory scent of the pot roast. It was not a complete, tearful admission of guilt. It did not erase the months of slander or the forged church documents. My mother remained incapable of total surrender, yet the acknowledgement proved the truth no longer lived exclusively inside my own head. Linda had lost sole control of the family story. I accepted the fractured olive branch without pretending it cured the underlying disease. My growth no longer required their perfection, it merely required their compliance. After dinner, the task of clearing plates offered a brief moment of isolation. I stood by the kitchen sink, running warm water over the ceramic dishes. Denise walked up beside me carrying the empty bread basket. She set it on the counter, keeping her eyes focused on the soapy water swirling in the basin. "Thank you," Denise whispered, her voice soft and lacking its usual sharp defensive edge, for making sure he ate. The gratitude felt rusty, clumsy from lack of use. Returning my attention to the sink, I picked up a dish towel to dry my hands. I looked at my sister, recognizing the fragile truce we now occupied. "I accept your thanks, Denise," I replied, keeping my tone level and firm. "But the rules have changed permanently. I will help Caleb through official school and church systems. I will advocate for his needs using every community resource available." I locked eyes with her, ensuring the boundary left zero room for interpretation. "But I will not be your secret pantry, your excuse, or your witness." Denise swallowed hard, offering no argument. She picked up a dish towel and began drying a plate, accepting the terms of her new, restricted reality. "A child eating is not a favor adults get to cash in," I added, delivering the final, definitive ruling on the matter. I turned back to the soapy water, plunging a sponge beneath the surface. I washed Caleb's plate, scraping away the remnants of the meal he had eaten in peace. I did not glance over my shoulder to check if Linda approved of my tone. I did not monitor Denise's facial expressions to gauge her emotional state. The compulsive need to manage their comfort had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a clean, sterile distance. My phone remained face down on the dining table, a testament to a life no longer governed by sudden, frantic demands or fabricated emergencies. The foundation of this family had fractured, but the boundaries I built ensured the debris would never again fall on me. I protected the child, secured my name, and walked away with my professional integrity intact. I would like to know what you would have done. Would you keep limited contact to ensure Caleb remained safe, or would you close the door on the family completely to protect your own peace? Tell me where you are listening from, and thank you for spending this time with me.